In this video, I'll be showing you the creation process of how I created this cheesecake artwork in Blender. But of course, this is a play on words. It's not actually a cheesecake, it's a chunk of Swiss cheese with some cake toppings. And if you'd like to purchase the finished artwork project files, you can get that with the links in the description on my Gumroad store and Patreon page. And joining one of my Patreon memberships is a great way to help support the channel because you'll be supporting the channel monthly and you'll get access to lots of Blender content. So I started off by modeling the cheese object, so I just added a cube, went into edit mode, scaled it down a bit, and then I selected both sides and just scaled it in a bit. Then I selected the front here and also scale it down, and then selected everything and also scale it down the Z-axis, and maybe also bring out the back. Then I wanted to add a bevel to smooth out the edges, so on the modifiers, I just added a bevel modifier, I turned up the segments and turned up the amount a bit. And then I just shaded the object smooth, I went into edit mode and I just hit Ctrl R to add some loop cuts. And I add some loop cuts on each side, so just like that, so it's pretty detailed. And then I applied the bevel modifier so it's all geometry. Now to create the holes for the Swiss cheese, what I did is went to the add menu and just added an icosphere. And on the icosphere settings, I turned it up a little bit to like a 4. Then in edit mode, I kind of scaled this down, moved it over here. And then in edit mode, I duplicated the icosphere and I just randomly placed it around inside the cheese. Then to cut out the holes, you can select the cheese and you can add the Boolean modifier, and on the object you can just choose the icosphere, leave it as difference, and then just apply the modifier. So now if I just select the icosphere, move it out of the way or delete it, you can see we just have some holes there in the cheese. And then I use the object context menu and I use the shade auto smooth, and that way it kind of shades this part smooth here, but then the sharp edges are shaded flat. So here's the final cheese object. So I added these holes all around the cheese. I added some bigger holes and some smaller holes and some holes on the end. Now as for the frosting, I went into edit mode and I went to the face select and I hit the C for the circle select, and I can scroll my mouse wheel and then just click and drag and just select the part of the frosting that I want to select. So any part where I want the frosting, I'm just going to select that entire area. So once you select the entire top, you can hit Shift D to duplicate. Then you can hit the escape key so it stays where it is. Then you can hit P and separate by selection. So that way back in object mode, this is its own object. So then what I did is I deleted the shade smooth by angle. I went to add modifier and I added a solidify modifier and just turned up the thickness, and I turned it into a negative value so the frosting is coming out. Then I also hit Ctrl 1 to add a subdivision surface with 1 level. So then what I did is just apply the solidify and apply the subdivision surface. So then what I did is went from object mode to sculpt mode and I started to sculpt this. But the topology is really messed up because you can see there's like some things stretching here. So what you can do is hit R to use the remesh. You can move up until the remesh is smaller and then hit Ctrl R, and that's going to remesh it. And then you can just sculpt along here, and I just kind of smoothed it out. So you can hold down the Shift key if you want to kind of smooth out some areas just like that. And then also to fill in the holes here, you can just go to one of the brushes here and just go along and just fill those holes and then smooth it out. Also, you can hit the G key to go to the grab brush, and you can click and drag and kind of drag down some little bits of frosting to make it look like the frosting is kind of melting down around the cheese. So here is the final frosting that I got on the top of the cheese. Now for the little bits of frosting which are here in the cheese holes, what I did is again went into edit mode and I just hit the C for the circle select, and I just selected all the faces which are where I wanted the frosting to be. Then I duplicated it, I hit P and separated it by selection, went back to object mode, and then with this object selected, I deleted the smooth by angle. I went to add modifier and added a solidify, and then I turned the thickness to a negative value. Then I hit Ctrl 1 to add a subdivision surface with 1 level, and then applied the solidify and the subdivision. So then what I did is went from object mode to sculpt mode. I hit R to change the size, and then once it was pretty small, I hit Ctrl R and that remeshed it. Then you can just hold down the Shift key in sculpt mode to kind of smooth out some areas. You can also use the grab brush by hitting G and kind of just shape it. And you can use some of the other brushes like the clay strips brush, and you can kind of just sculpt along here and just sculpt the shape of the frosting. So that's what I did for these little pieces of frosting which are on the side of the cheese. Now I also wanted to model some little pieces of frosting on the plate here to make it look like the frosting kind of dribbled down and fell down. So these were really easy to model. They were basically just a cube, and I extruded out some of the faces of the cube, and then I added subsurf modifiers to them so they look nice and smooth. And those were the little pieces of the frosting which kind of dribbled down onto the plate. Now for modeling the plate, this was pretty easy, so I just added a circle and then I extruded up the sides of the circle. I also added some loop cuts here to kind of sharpen up this area, and then I brought the end of the plate up and also added a loop cut to kind of thicken up and sharpen that edge there. And then I added a solidify modifier to give it some thickness and also a subdivision surface. Now for the candle object, I went to the add menu and I added a circle. And I went to top view and I went into edit mode. And then what I did is hit the B for the box select, and I box selected these vertices here and also these ones here. And then I also selected that one there and this one there and this here and that there. So you can see I've just selected them in increments with a few in between. Then I'll hit the O key to turn on proportional editing, and I can scale this all down and scroll my mouse wheel to change the size of the proportional editing. And I'll just scale that down like that. So you can basically see we have this round kind of flower shape. Then I went to front view and I extruded up the candle like that, and then I hit the F key to fill the faces, go to this side, select that bottom face and fill the faces. And then I also went to face select and I insetted the bottom face and also the top face, so the bottom face and top face, both inset those. So that's going to be the basic shape of the candle, but I also want to rotate it around to kind of get those rotated spots which are coming out. So what I did is hit Control R and I scrolled my mouse wheel until we had a lot of cuts there, and then just left click and right click so the cuts stay in the center. Then what I did is held down the Alt key, selected that loop of faces there, and then hold down the Shift key and select that face. So now with the proportional editing still turned on, I can rotate this and I'll rotate it on the Z axis, and then I can scroll my mouse wheel. And you can see the proportional editing is pulling along the rest of the candle, so we can rotate the entire candle around. And then you can see right here at the very end, the candle is kind of getting smoother. So if I just hit Control Z to undo that, what I can do instead is click here on the fall off, and I can change the fall off to linear here on the proportional editing. Now if I rotate this on the Z axis, you can see now it's going to be nice and linear, so it's not going to rotate less as it goes up to the top of the selection. And then in object mode, just shade it smooth, and that's how I created the candle. So I just stuck the candle there on the top of the cheesecake, and then I also modeled a basic wick. And then for the flame, this was just a cylinder, which I kind of extruded up and scaled down to create the flame shape, and it kind of looks like a water droplet. So now it was time to do some lighting so I could set up the materials. So for the lighting, for the HDRI, I used this Studio Country Hall 1K HDRI from polyhaven.com. Links in the description if you want to download it. Over here on the render properties, I went down to the film tab and just chose the transparent button. And to make the lighting and colors look nicer, here on the color management, I used AGX and very high contrast. Now I added a few different area lights pointing at the cheesecake, and to make the area lights so they're always pointed at the cheese, you can select the area light and you can click right here to go to the constraints properties, and you can add the track to constraint. Then here on the target object, you can just choose the cheese. And this way, when I move the area light around, it's always going to follow the cheese object. So now let's jump into the materials. So the first material that I made is kind of this stylized cheese material. So for this, I did it in cycles render, and in cycles render, you can use this geometry node here, and the geometry node has this pointiness value. So if you look really close, you can see the pointiness value is lighter on the edges, but then in the cracks and crevices is a bit darker. So then I put the pointiness value through a color ramp, and that way the outside of the cheese is more of the yellow, but then the inside of the holes is more orange. And I put that into the base color. I also turned the roughness of the material down so it's a little bit more shiny. And then I also added this noise texture here, and I put the noise texture into the bump and turned it to a very small number. So you can see now the surface of the cheese just looks slightly bumpy. And then to really make it look like cheese, I went here to the subsurface and I changed this to random walk skin. And then let me just zoom in here to kind of the edges so you can kind of see the subsurf. So then I turned the weight all the way up to 1. So you can see here it is without the subsurface. It just looks more like a plasticky material. But if I turn up the subsurface weight, it really looks more soft and more edible, and it looks a lot more like food. Now for the frosting material, I did want to add a little bit of bump over the surface. So I again added this basic noise texture, and I put that through a bump node. So you can see it just has a little bit of bump, and then put that into the principled shader. Then for the color, I went with this like classic pink color. I also turned the roughness down to make it a bit reflective, and then I also turned up the subsurface weight, and I left the type set to random walk because I liked how that looked. But you can see again the subsurface weight allows light to go through the mesh, so it looks a lot more soft and more like food. And then for the candle wax material, I made it a dark blue color. I turned down the roughness, and again I turned up the subsurface weight so it looks a lot more like natural soft candle wax. And then here for the flame, I added a gradient texture, and I used this mapping rotation, and I rotated the gradient so it's black down here and then white up here. I then put that through a color ramp so it's more red down here and more yellow up here, and finally put that into an emission. And then later on, I did add a bloom in the compositor, but I'll be going over that later. The plate material was really simple. It was just kind of a light gray color with the roughness turned down. Now I also wanted to add some sprinkles to the cheesecake to make it look a lot more like cake, so I modeled these very simple sprinkles sprinkle objects. So these are all pretty similar, but I did add some ones which are circular, and then some shorter ones and some longer ones, and then a few round ones. Now for the materials of the sprinkles, I wanted each sprinkle to be a randomly different object. So for that, I used this object info node, and the object info has a random value. And then I put that through a color ramp, and I gave it all of these different colors, and finally put that into the base color and turned the roughness down. That way, every time I duplicate one of the sprinkles, you can see that they're all going to be a randomly different color. And then here in Blender's outliner, I just created a sprinkles collection and put all the sprinkles in that collection. Then to add the sprinkles on the frosting, I added this very simple geometry node setup, and I have a tutorial on how to do this exact setup. So if you want to check out that tutorial and learn how to do it yourself, links are in the description. So then I just added the same geometry node setup to the other parts of the frosting. And then for these little bits of frosting down here, I added the same geometry node setup. Now for the sprinkles on the plate, I wanted to weight paint where I wanted the sprinkles to show up. So to do that, with the plate selected, I went here in object mode and went here to weight paint. And then you can see I just painted around where I wanted the sprinkles to be. And then I used this setup here on the geometry nodes. So I put the density factor into the density factor here, the group input. And then right over here on the geometry nodes, you can click on the input attribute toggle and you can choose the point group. And I have a tutorial on how to do this, so if you want to learn how to weight paint where you want geometry nodes to show up on an object, you can check out this video here, linked in the description. Now once I rendered the scene, I went to Blender's Compositor and I wanted to add a bit of a vignette. So I added this box mask and I made it really big, so it's white in the center, but then it's black on the edges. Then I put this through a blur node and I turned up the blur size, so now you can see it's black here on the edges, and then it slowly gets more and more white into the center. Then I put that through an alpha over, and the blur goes into the top factor, and then the render layers goes into the bottom one. Then this color right here, this is going to be the color of the vignette. And then finally, I added this glare node. I added it right after the render layers, and I set the type to bloom, and then I played around with the threshold just so that the candle is kind of glowing. And here's the final render. So that's how I created this cute little cheesecake render in Blender. So it was a fun little artwork to make, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned some tips and tricks in this video which you can implement into your own artwork creation. And if you'd like to purchase the finished artwork project files, you can get that with the links in the description. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.